Life in the suburban paradise of Willow Creek Estates was, to put it mildly, aggressively mediocre. The lawns were uniformly green, thanks to an HOA-approved fertilizer schedule. The houses were painted in shades of beige that could cure insomnia, and the only excitement came from Mrs. Davis's bi-weekly potluck gossip sessions. This was the kind of place where you could set your watch by the sound of Mr. Wilson's leaf blower on Saturday mornings. It was, in short, the American dream, if your dream involved crippling conformity and crippling debt. Into this idyllic, albeit soul-crushing, scene strode John, a federal judge with a dry wit sharper than a freshly sharpened gavel, and his son, Tommy. Tommy, blessed with a sunny disposition and a mischievous grin, navigated the world with the help of his guide dog, Lucky. Lucky was a golden retriever with the patience of a saint and a penchant for sniffing out the juiciest discarded hot dogs within a 5-mile radius. He was, in Tommy's words, the best damn wingman a blind guy could ask for. Now, John wasn't your typical judge. He didn't wear a powdered wig, thank God, and he had a healthy disrespect for bureaucratic nonsense. He believed in justice, fairness, and the Oxford comma. He also believed that life was too short to argue with homeowners' associations. Unfortunately, the universe, in its infinite wisdom, or lack thereof, had other plans. Enter Karen, the HOA president. Karen was a force of nature, a beige-clad titan with a clipboard and a laser focus on enforcing the rules. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her nails were impeccably manicured, and her heart was rumored to be made of the same synthetic material as the outdoor furniture she so fiercely defended. Karen considered herself the guardian of Willow Creek Estate's pristine aesthetic, and she viewed anything that deviated from the norm with suspicion and thinly veiled contempt. And Lucky, bless his furry little heart, was a major deviation. It started innocently enough. A passive-aggressive note taped to John's door. Reminder: all pets must be under 25 pounds. Lucky, being a golden retriever in his prime, tipped the scales at a robust 70 pounds. John, channeling his inner legal eagle, fired back with a polite but firm letter citing the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, which clearly stated that guide dogs were exempt from such frivolous weight restrictions. Karen, however, was not easily deterred. She saw the ADA as more of a suggestion than an actual law. The letters escalated. First, it was complaints about Lucky's excessive barking. Apparently, the occasional woof was a threat to the neighborhood's serenity. Then came accusations of Lucky relieving himself improperly. Never mind that John religiously cleaned up after him. Finally, she accused Lucky of intimidating the local squirrels. The squirrels, John suspected, were probably just jealous of Lucky's good looks and superior sniffing skills. John tried reasoning with Karen. He invited her over for tea, which she declined, citing a strict chamomile-only policy. He explained, patiently and repeatedly, that Lucky was not a pet but a working dog, a lifeline for his son. He even offered to provide documentation, training certificates, and a sworn affidavit from Lucky himself, if dogs could swear. But Karen was unmoved. "Rules are rules," she declared, her voice dripping with the saccharine sweetness of a diet soda. And the Willow Creek Estate's HOA bylaws clearly state that all dogs must be miniature poodles named Fluffy or Precious. John, a man who had stared down hardened criminals and navigated the treacherous waters of the legal system, was starting to feel defeated. He knew he could fight this, he had the law on his side, but the sheer absurdity of the situation was exhausting. He just wanted his son to live a normal life, without having to worry about some power-hungry HOA president trying to evict his canine companion. Things came to a head at the annual HOA meeting, a spectacle of suburban passive aggression that John usually avoided like the plague. But this time, he felt compelled to attend, to defend his son and his dog against the tyranny of beige conformity. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile, windowless room decorated with inspirational posters featuring stock photos of smiling families. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and simmering resentment. Karen, perched on a plastic folding chair like a queen on her throne, surveyed the room with a smug expression. John stood up to speak, his voice calm but firm. He reiterated the ADA, he pleaded for common sense, He even offered to dress Lucky in a tiny HOA-approved beige sweater, which, in retrospect, might have been a step too far. But Karen was having none of it. "Mr. Smith," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "we appreciate your concerns. However, the HOA has a responsibility to uphold the standards of this community. And unfortunately, your dog does not meet those standards." A murmur went through the crowd. Mrs. Davis, ever the busybody, leaned over to whisper to Mr. Wilson, who nodded sagely. John could feel the eyes of the entire neighborhood boring into him. He was being publicly humiliated, and his son was paying the price. But Karen wasn't finished. "In fact," she continued, her voice rising in pitch, "I've already contacted the authorities. They'll be here shortly to resolve the situation." John's blood ran cold. He knew what she meant. She had called the police to take away Lucky. He looked at Tommy, who was sitting beside him, oblivious to the impending disaster. He had to do something, anything, to protect his son. And that's when the cavalry arrived. Not in the form of a legal defense team or a squadron of ADA advocates, but in the form of Officer Dave, a local police officer with a kind face, a weary sigh, and a growing sense of dread. Officer Dave, it turned out, was a dog lover himself. He had a rescue mutt named Sparky who was, in his words, a bit of a handful. He also had a healthy respect for the law, even when the law was being twisted and weaponized by a suburban tyrant with a clipboard. He approached John and Tommy with a sympathetic expression. "Mr. Smith," he said, "I'm sorry, but I have to ask you to surrender your dog." John couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Officer," he pleaded, "this is a guide dog. He's protected by law. You can't just take him away." Officer Dave sighed. "I know, sir, I know, but the HOA, they're very insistent. And technically, they do have a point about the bylaws." John wanted to scream. He wanted to punch something, preferably Karen's perfectly coiffed hair, but he knew that wouldn't solve anything. He looked at Tommy, who was starting to sense that something was wrong. "Dad," Tommy asked, his voice trembling, "what's happening?" John knelt down and put his arm around his son. "It's okay, Tommy," he said, his voice strained. "Everything's going to be okay." But he knew it wasn't. As Officer Dave led Lucky away, Tommy started to cry. The sound of his sobs echoed through the sterile clubhouse, a testament to the cruelty of bureaucracy and the power of a petty HOA president. Mrs. Davis and Mr. Wilson watched with morbid fascination, their eyes gleaming with schadenfreude. The sight of Lucky being whisked away in the back of a police cruiser was enough to curdle the milk of human kindness, even in Willow Creek Estates. Tommy's sobs were a stark contrast to the meticulously manicured lawns and the cheerful, yet soulless, holiday decorations that adorned the houses. For a brief, fleeting moment, even Mrs. Davis seemed to experience a pang of something resembling empathy, though it was quickly replaced by the burning need to dissect the situation with her fellow gossips. John, however, was operating on a different plane. The injustice of the situation had ignited a fire within him, a righteous fury tempered by years of legal training and a healthy dose of sarcasm. He may have looked calm on the surface, but inside, he was already plotting Karen's downfall with the precision of a seasoned chess master. "Don't worry, Tommy," John said, his voice deceptively gentle. "We'll get Lucky back. I promise you." Tommy, bless his heart, still had faith in his dad. He wiped his eyes and nodded, his little face etched with worry. "You promise, Dad?" "I promise," John said, his eyes hardening with resolve. "And I also promise that Karen will regret the day she ever messed with the Smith family." With Tommy safely tucked in at home, John set to work. First, he called Officer Dave, the beleaguered police officer who had been forced to carry out Karen's petty vendetta. "Officer Dave," John said, his voice polite but firm, "I understand you were just doing your job, but I need to know where Lucky is being held, and I need to know what justification Karen provided for seizing him." Officer Dave, clearly relieved to be talking to someone who wasn't screaming about HOA bylaws, readily provided the information. Lucky was being held at the local animal shelter, and Karen had cited multiple violations of the Willow Creek Estate's pet policy, including the infamous excessive barking and improper relief infractions. "Look, Mr. Smith," Officer Dave said, his voice laced with sympathy. "I feel terrible about this. I know Lucky's a guide dog, and I know you're just trying to do what's best for your son. But Karen's been on a real power trip lately. She's been threatening to file complaints against the entire department if we didn't cooperate." John, who had dealt with his fair share of bureaucratic bullies, understood the situation perfectly. "Thank you, Officer Dave," he said. "I appreciate your honesty. And don't worry, I won't hold you responsible for any of this." With Lucky's location secured, John turned his attention to his primary target, Karen. He needed to find a way to expose her hypocrisy and abuse of power, to make her pay for the emotional distress she had caused his son. And he knew just where to start: the Willow Creek Estate's HOA bylaws. John spent the next few hours poring over the HOA documents, his legal mind dissecting every clause, every comma, every obscure regulation. He was looking for any loophole, any inconsistency, any violation that he could use against Karen and the HOA. And, as luck would have it, pun intended, he found plenty. It turned out that the Willow Creek Estate's HOA was riddled with inconsistencies and violations. The architectural guidelines were vague and unenforceable. The financial records were a mess of questionable expenses and hidden fees. And the very bylaws that Karen so zealously enforced were, in many cases, in direct violation of state and federal law. But John wasn't just interested in exposing these violations. He wanted to exploit them, to use them to turn the tables on Karen and the HOA. He wanted to create a situation where they were the ones facing fines, lawsuits, and public humiliation. His first target was the landscaping. According to the HOA bylaws, all residents were required to maintain their lawns according to a strict schedule, using only HOA-approved fertilizers and pesticides. However, John discovered that the HOA had been secretly dumping excess chemicals into the local watershed, causing significant environmental damage. John, being a responsible citizen and a master of passive-aggressive revenge, immediately reported the violations to the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. He also made sure to accidentally mention Karen's name as the person in charge of the landscaping committee. Next, he turned his attention to the architectural guidelines. The HOA required all residents to obtain approval for any exterior modifications to their homes, no matter how minor. However, John discovered that Karen had recently installed a new satellite dish on her roof without obtaining the necessary permits. John, again acting as a concerned neighbor, promptly filed a complaint with the local zoning board, citing the unsightly appearance of Karen's satellite dish and its potential impact on property values. He also made sure to include a detailed photograph of the offending dish, taken from multiple angles. But John wasn't content with just reporting Karen's violations. He wanted to create new ones, to lure her into a trap of her own making. He decided to exploit her obsession with maintaining the aesthetic purity of Willow Creek Estates. One evening, under the cover of darkness, John accidentally left a pile of construction debris in his front yard. He also forgot to trim his hedges, allowing them to grow wild and unruly. And, just for good measure, he replaced his perfectly beige mailbox with a bright pink one shaped like a flamingo. He knew it wouldn't be long before Karen noticed the violations. And he knew that she wouldn't be able to resist the urge to take action. Sure enough, the next morning, Karen was at John's doorstep, her face contorted with outrage. "Mr. Smith?" she shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that could shatter glass. "What do you think you're doing? You're violating every rule in the HOA handbook." John, feigning innocence, simply shrugged. "I'm sorry, Karen," he said. "I didn't realize I was doing anything wrong. I'm just trying to express my individuality." Karen sputtered with indignation. "Individuality? This is Willow Creek Estates, Mr. Smith. We don't tolerate individuality. We have standards to uphold." "But Karen," John said, his eyes twinkling with mischief, "isn't that what you always say? Rules are rules." Karen, realizing that she had walked right into his trap, turned a shade of red that rivaled the pink flamingo mailbox. She knew that she had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and thoroughly humiliated. But John wasn't finished yet. "Oh, and Karen," he added as she turned to leave, "I almost forgot to mention, I'm planning to paint my house bright purple next week. I hope that won't be a problem." Karen, unable to speak, simply stormed off, leaving John to revel in the satisfaction of his petty revenge. Karen's visit to John's individualistic front yard was the equivalent of pouring gasoline on a dumpster fire. The woman was already teetering on the brink of a full-blown meltdown, and John's passive-aggressive sabotage had pushed her right over the edge. From that moment on, she was a woman possessed, driven by a singular, all-consuming goal: to make John Smith's life a living hell. Unfortunately for Karen, and hilariously for us, her attempts at retaliation only served to escalate the situation, turning Willow Creek Estates into a veritable battleground of suburban warfare. First, she sent John a barrage of official HOA violation notices, each one more absurd than the last. He was cited for everything from excessive bird feeder activity. Apparently, the local sparrows were attracting unwanted attention, to unapproved holiday decorations. His inflatable T-Rex wearing a Santa hat was deemed inappropriate for the community aesthetic. John, of course, responded to each violation with a carefully worded letter, citing relevant legal precedents and poking holes in Karen's logic with the precision of a brain surgeon. He even started CCNG the entire HOA board on his responses, much to Karen's chagrin. But Karen wasn't just relying on official channels. She also resorted to more underhanded tactics. She started spreading rumors about John to the other neighbors, accusing him of everything from being a secret anarchist to being a hoarder of garden gnomes. She even organized a neighborhood watch group to monitor John's activities, turning Mrs. Davis and Mr. Wilson into self-appointed spies. John, however, was always one step ahead of her. He knew that Karen was trying to isolate him, to turn the entire community against him. So he decided to fight fire with fire, using her own tactics against her. He started attending every HOA meeting, armed with a stack of documents and a disarming smile. He would politely but relentlessly question every decision, challenge every policy, and generally make Karen's life miserable. He even started proposing his own amendments to the HOA bylaws, each one more ridiculous than the last. One of his proposals, for example, called for the mandatory installation of disco balls on all rooftops to promote community harmony. Another proposed that all residents be required to wear brightly colored clown costumes on Tuesdays to celebrate the joy of life. The HOA board, initially bewildered by John's antics, quickly grew to resent him. They saw him as a troublemaker, a rebel, a threat to their carefully constructed world of suburban conformity. But they also knew that they couldn't simply ignore him. He was a federal judge, after all, and he had a way of making things very uncomfortable for anyone who crossed him. As the battle between John and Karen escalated, the entire community of Willow Creek Estates began to unravel. The carefully constructed facade of suburban tranquility started to crumble, revealing the simmering resentments and petty rivalries that lay beneath the surface. Neighbors started arguing with each other over everything from lawn care to holiday decorations. The HOA board became paralyzed by infighting, unable to agree on anything. And the once pristine streets of Willow Creek Estates were now littered with political signs, protest banners, and the occasional rogue flamingo. John, of course, was secretly enjoying the chaos. He had set out to expose Karen's hypocrisy and abuse of power, and he was succeeding beyond his wildest dreams. He had turned Willow Creek Estates into a microcosm of the larger political landscape, a battleground of ideologies and egos. But John wasn't just interested in causing chaos. He also wanted to use his newfound influence to make things better for the community. He started organizing neighborhood cleanups, hosting community potlucks, and even offering free legal advice to anyone who needed it. He quickly won over many of the residents, who saw him as a champion of the underdog, a defender of individual rights against the tyranny of the HOA. They started to rally around him, supporting his efforts to reform the community and hold Karen accountable for her actions. One evening, John decided to take his campaign directly to the people. He organized a town hall meeting in his front yard, inviting all the residents of Willow Creek Estates to come and share their concerns about the HOA. To his surprise, the meeting was a huge success. Dozens of people showed up, eager to vent their frustrations and voice their support for John. They spoke of petty fines, arbitrary regulations, and the general feeling that the HOA was more concerned with maintaining appearances than with serving the community. As the meeting went on, a clear consensus began to emerge. Karen had to go. The residents of Willow Creek Estates had had enough of her tyranny, her hypocrisy, and her general lack of empathy. They wanted a new leader, someone who would listen to their concerns and represent their interests. John, of course, was happy to oblige. He knew that the time had come to strike the final blow, to deliver the coup de grace that would finally bring Karen's reign of terror to an end. He announced that he was planning to file a lawsuit against Karen and the HOA, alleging a pattern of abuse of power, financial mismanagement, and violations of state and federal law. He invited anyone who had been harmed by Karen's actions to join him in the lawsuit. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of residents signed up to join the lawsuit, eager to seek justice and hold Karen accountable for her misdeeds. The tide had turned. Karen was no longer in control. She was now facing a full-scale rebellion, led by the unlikely duo of a federal judge and a golden retriever. The lawsuit filed by John and the disgruntled residents of Willow Creek Estates sent shockwaves through the entire community. Karen, who had always considered herself untouchable, was suddenly facing the prospect of financial ruin, public humiliation, and possibly even jail time. The HOA board, already paralyzed by infighting, descended into a state of complete panic. The local news media, sensing a juicy story, descended upon Willow Creek Estates like vultures on a carcass. They interviewed John, they interviewed Karen, they even interviewed Lucky, though his comments were mostly limited to enthusiastic tail wags and slobbery kisses. The trial itself was a spectacle of suburban absurdity. The courtroom was packed with residents, eager to witness the downfall of their former oppressor. Mrs. Davis and Mr. Wilson, naturally, had prime seats, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. John, representing himself and the other plaintiffs, was a force to be reckoned with. He presented a mountain of evidence, meticulously documenting Karen's abuses of power, financial mismanagement, and violations of state and federal law. He called witnesses who testified about petty fines, arbitrary regulations, and the general feeling of oppression that had permeated Willow Creek Estates under Karen's leadership. Karen, representing herself, because no lawyer in their right mind would take her case, was a disaster. She stammered, she contradicted herself, and she generally made a fool of herself on the stand. She tried to argue that she was just trying to uphold the standards of the community, but her arguments fell flat in the face of John's overwhelming evidence. Officer Dave, surprisingly, was called as a witness by John. He testified about Karen's threats to the police department and her insistence on seizing Lucky, even though he knew it was a violation of the ADA. He admitted that he had acted under duress and that he regretted his role in the whole affair. The turning point of the trial came when John introduced a piece of evidence that he had been saving for just the right moment. A hidden camera recording of Karen admitting to deliberately targeting him and his son because she didn't like their individualistic lifestyle. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Karen's face turned a shade of crimson that rivaled the pink flamingo mailbox. She tried to deny the recording, but John produced the original file, proving that it was authentic. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a dry wit and a healthy respect for the law, was clearly appalled by Karen's behavior. She leaned forward and addressed Karen directly. "Ms. Karen's last name," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I have been practicing law for over 30 years, and I can honestly say that I have never seen a case as egregious as this. You have abused your power, you have violated the rights of your fellow citizens, and you have generally acted like a petty tyrant. I am frankly disgusted by your behavior." The judge then turned to the jury and gave them their instructions. She told them that if they found Karen guilty of any of the charges, they should award the plaintiffs damages commensurate with the harm they had suffered. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts. They awarded the plaintiffs a substantial sum of money, enough to compensate them for their financial losses, their emotional distress, and their general suffering. But the judge wasn't finished yet. She also ordered Karen to be removed from her position as HOA president and banned her from ever serving on the HOA board again. She also ordered Karen to attend anger management classes and perform community service, picking up trash along the streets of Willow Creek Estates, under the watchful eye of Mrs. Davis and Mr. Wilson, of course. The courtroom erupted in cheers. The residents of Willow Creek Estates had finally won. They had overthrown their oppressor and restored justice to their community. As Karen was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, for a minor contempt of court charge, naturally, she glared at John with a look of pure hatred. "You haven't won, Smith," she hissed. "This isn't over." John simply smiled. "Oh, Karen," he said, "it's over. You're done. And by the way, I'm planning to paint my house rainbow next week. I hope that won't be a problem." With Karen out of the picture, Willow Creek Estates began to heal. The HOA board was replaced with a group of more reasonable and compassionate individuals. The petty fines were eliminated, the arbitrary regulations were relaxed, and the community as a whole became more tolerant and accepting. And Lucky, of course, was finally returned to Tommy. The reunion was a tearjerker, even for the most cynical observers. Tommy hugged Lucky tightly, burying his face in his fur. Lucky licked Tommy's face, wagging his tail furiously. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. John watched the scene with a satisfied smile. He had set out to get revenge on Karen for what she had done to his son, and he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He had not only restored justice to Willow Creek Estates, but also created a better community for everyone who lived there. Life in Willow Creek Estates, post-Karen, was like Dorothy waking up in a Technicolor Oz. The oppressive grayness had lifted, replaced by a vibrant tapestry of individuality, acceptance, and the occasional brightly colored flamingo. The HOA board, now comprised of genuinely well-meaning, if slightly overwhelmed residents, actually listened to the concerns of the community. The petty fines were a thing of the past, and the architectural guidelines were relaxed to allow for a bit of creative expression, within reason. Of course, nobody wanted a full-scale Burning Man installation on their front lawn. John, the unlikely hero of this suburban saga, became something of a local legend. He was still a federal judge, of course, but he was also known as the guy who took down the HOA tyrant and brought freedom and rainbow-colored houses to Willow Creek Estates. He was even invited to speak at the annual neighborhood picnic, where he delivered a rousing speech about the importance of community, tolerance, and the Oxford comma, much to the confusion of some attendees. Tommy, naturally, was thrilled to have Lucky back. The two were inseparable, exploring the newly liberated streets of Willow Creek Estates and enjoying the newfound sense of community. Tommy even started a support group for kids with disabilities, providing a safe space for them to share their experiences and advocate for their rights. As for Karen, well, let's just say that her life took a turn for the beige. Stripped of her power, her reputation tarnished, and her bank account significantly lighter, she was forced to face the consequences of her actions. The court-ordered community service, picking up trash along the streets of Willow Creek Estates, was particularly humiliating, especially since Mrs. Davis and Mr. Wilson, armed with their gossip networks and their insatiable need for schadenfreude, made sure to document her every move. They followed her around with their smartphones, snapping photos of her struggling to pick up stray soda cans and discarded candy wrappers. They even started a hashtag Karen Cleanup Crew. The anger management classes, too, were less than successful. Karen spent most of the sessions arguing with the therapist, insisting that she was the victim and that everyone else was just trying to persecute her. She eventually dropped out, claiming that the classes were a waste of time and that the therapist was a liberal snowflake. But the real twist in the story came several months after the trial, when John received a letter from Karen. He was initially hesitant to open it, fearing that it was some kind of elaborate revenge plot. But curiosity got the better of him, and he carefully unfolded the letter. To his surprise, the letter was an apology. Karen wrote that she had finally realized the error of her ways, that she had been blinded by her own ego and her obsession with control. She admitted that she had treated John and Tommy unfairly, and that she was deeply sorry for the pain she had caused them. She went on to say that she had been doing a lot of soul-searching and that she had decided to dedicate her life to helping others. She was volunteering at a local homeless shelter, working to rehabilitate rescued animals, and generally trying to make amends for her past misdeeds. John was stunned. He had never expected Karen to apologize, let alone undergo such a dramatic transformation. He wasn't sure if he fully believed her, but he decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. He wrote her back, thanking her for her apology and wishing her well in her future endeavors. He even invited her to attend the next neighborhood picnic, offering her a chance to reconnect with the community she had once tried to control. To everyone's surprise, Karen accepted the invitation. She arrived at the picnic looking nervous but determined. She apologized to the residents of Willow Creek Estates, one by one, and offered to help with the cleanup. The reception was mixed. Some people were still skeptical, but others were willing to give her a second chance. And as the day went on, Karen slowly began to win them over with her sincerity and her willingness to work hard. In the end, Karen's redemption was a reminder that even the most stubborn and misguided individuals are capable of change. It was a testament to the power of forgiveness, compassion, and the occasional brightly colored flamingo. As for John, he continued to serve as a federal judge, dispensing justice and fighting for the rights of the underdog. He also continued to advocate for people with disabilities, using his platform to raise awareness and promote inclusion. And yes, he did eventually paint his house rainbow. It was a bold and beautiful statement of individuality, tolerance, and the enduring power of suburban rebellion. It also made Karen's house, still stubbornly beige, look even more drab and depressing by comparison.